Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our program today, Locating Jewish Women in the Archives. My name is Rachel King. I am the Executive Director of the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at American Ancestors. The Jewish Heritage Center is a research and educational center dedicated to preserving New England Jewish history, exploring Jewish heritage, and illuminating the American Jewish experience for wide audiences. We are located in Boston at American Ancestors, a national center for history, heritage, and culture. Before I introduce you to our presenter today, I'd like to make just a couple of notes about this webinar. You in the audience will be muted and off screen, but we would love to hear from you. So please type your questions and comments into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to as many as we can following Gabrielle Roth's presentation. I'd also like to mention that we are broadcasting from different locations today, and so we hope you'll bear with us if we experience any technological difficulties. There may be a thunderstorm in our area in the next hour. Even if you encounter or we encounter any issues, we will be sending a link to the recording of this session so that you can watch it later. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter today and my colleague, Gabrielle Roth. Gabrielle is the Collections Management Archivist at the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center. In this role, she supervises the preservation, maintenance, and use of the more than 4 million documents in our archival collections. Gabrielle is an ACA certified archivist and a member of the Society of American Archivists and the New England Archivists. She earned a Master of Science in Information Studies with endorsements in archives and preservation, as well as a certificate in museum studies from the University of Texas at Austin. She also has a Master of Fine Arts degree from Rutgers University. As you'll see today, in addition to her professional skills, Gabrielle is deeply committed to uncovering the lives and the stories behind the records in our collections and to honoring the legacy of the people whose history we preserve. So without further ado, welcome Gabrielle Roth.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that warm introduction. And I am so happy to join all of you here today to ask the question, where are the ladies, right? So today in this presentation, I'm going to go over a few different things about where you can locate women in the archive. And first, we're going to look at three major groups. We're going to look at vital records, archival collections, and contextual research. Now, before any project, it's really important to define your research objectives. So you want to know what it is that I'm trying to look for today when I set out to research. Here are some good examples of research objectives, such as determining a maiden name, clarifying family lines, or just adding some context. When I'm organizing information about my ancestors, I like to use a spreadsheet because it can help me keep track of all the different things that I'm finding out. So you can record information as you research, and it can help you to identify more resources as you continue the search. We'll start off today by talking about vital records. Vital records are documents created by civil authorities close to the time of an event, such as a birth, marriage, divorce, or death, and they list key information. Vital records can be used to identify ancestors, verify life facts, and confirm relationships. Vital record certificates did not exist before the 1900s when vital record collection became standardized in the United States. Before this, a government clerk would record a vital event record in a ledger. Here's a couple of tips when using vital records. Always look for the original. Indexes and transcriptions rarely provide all the details. Historically, spellings were not standardized, so think phonetically. Start with a broad search, then narrow onto specific details. Don't overlook under-indexed collections, and analyze each vital record in context alongside other records so that you can make sure you're keeping track of everything. So first, we're going to talk about birth records. In the United States, we didn't have a standardized system of birth registration until 1902, when this was established by the census. Only some states had been collecting birth registrations, and Massachusetts is one of them. Other nations have different standards. For example, the UK began collecting birth registrations in 1853. Birth records often include a child's name, sex, date, and place of birth. The parents' names are included, although the mother's maiden name was not usually captured until the mid-1800s. And in the 20th century, birth records usually have additional information, such as parents' addresses, occupations, and their ages, birthplaces, and religious affiliations. Marriage records include the couple's name, the date and place of the marriage, and additional information depends on the laws in effect for the jurisdiction when the marriage took place. For example, a marriage record often includes the birth dates and birthplaces of the couple, as well as the current residence of each. Occupations are sometimes captured, and 20th century records may document the name, birthplace of the bride and their parents. Many jurisdictions include whether the bride and groom are single, widowed, or divorced, which can be great insight into their lives. You can also look for marriage intentions, which might be recorded in town record books, which are the equivalent of a modern day marriage license. I particularly love this marriage license from our collection on the right because you have photographs of the bride and the groom and their parents. So that's kind of a lovely addition. The last vital record is a death record. Death records include the name of the deceased, the date, and the place of the death, as well as the cause. Late 19th century death records began to include the names of the parents of the deceased and where the parents were born, usually just a country or state name. Some late 19th century records will also include biographical information of the deceased, such as their birth date and place, occupation, and the name of a surviving spouse. This can be particularly great for locating women in those records. Death records become particularly important if the person was born before a widespread recording of births, but lived until the mid to late 19th century, when detailed records began to be collected. The birth record may be missing, but a good death record can fill in the blanks. Now let's touch on archival collections. Archival collections are resources where you can find secondary sources of vital information. Archives hold primary source materials that can be used as secondary sources for confirmation or to find other vital record information. We're going to look at Bible records, religious contracts, cemetery records, temple records, just to name a few. First, let's look at a family Bible and record book. Family Bibles and record books often contain vital information for family members, and it might include the birth, death, and marriage. Some will also include separation information of parents and children, like this one. You can evaluate the quality of the information by comparing the recorded dates to the date of publication on the Bible. So if it's in an actual Bible, compare it to that Bible. Dates that are before the publication dates suggest that the material was entered after the fact and not at the time of the event. So always be a little scrupulous. Also look at the inks and the handwriting. Are they the same or are they different? Again, this is a sign of whether the information was recorded all at one time or as the events took place. And finally, who owned this record book? Was it a known family member or was it somebody outside of the family? You can also look to religious marriage contracts. A ketubah, the Jewish religious marriage contract, exists to protect the wife so that her husband will care for her. In addition to financial clauses, it also includes obligations undertaken by the groom, including financial clauses and traditional conjugal rights such as food, clothing, and shelter. Depending on your family's origin, the ketubah may be more or less decorative. Some communities of Jews in the Pale of Settlement viewed it as a purely formal legal document, which is why many of the preserved copies are from communities in the Middle East, Africa, and Western European areas where we have these really beautiful illustrated and illuminated ketubah. Most record the date, location, and names of the bride and groom as well as their parents. So these can be a pretty good indication of not only that vital information is secondary, but also what it was that their relationship meant to them and what they wanted to be defined within their ketubah. The next is cemetery records. Manuscript collections often include transcriptions of gravestones from obscure cemeteries. You may find, in addition to the date of death, the date of birth, the maiden name, spouse, or even place of origin. As you can see here in this cemetery index, that the information available for different persons of different sex is impacted. You can see here that Abrahamson Jacob Lewis has many pieces of information pulled together, while Abrams Dora is missing quite a bit. We know when she died, and we know her husband. You want to check catalogs by location, cemetery name, or by religious institution. If you don't know the name of a cemetery, use local publications such as the Jewish Genealogical Society of Greater Boston's Jewish Cemeteries and Funeral Homes in Massachusetts by Alexander Woodall, A Guide to Massachusetts Cemeteries by my colleague at NEHGS, genealogist David Allen Lambert, or online databases such as those at American Ancestors. Community aggregated information is also available on findagrave.com. The next is temple records. And I want to ask, why is it so hard to find good records from synagogues? It's because they're so often run by the people who are their congregants. And so if you are thinking this and you happen to be a member at a congregation, it is your duty to make sure that those records are well maintained. So keep an eye out for membership records, naming ceremonies, holiday seat records, B'nai Mitzvah, cemetery and burial records, event programs and pamphlets, yearbooks, board meeting minutes, Hebrew school information, and your lady auxiliaries. All of these are places that if a temple has maintained its records, you may have some insight into where the women in your ancestral line were, in fact, going to be recorded. Religious leaders also often were the keepers of the earlier shul records. Many congregations shared rabbis, and so you'd have one rabbi going from congregation to congregation. You can check local county histories for the names of the early temples and their clergy. You can also search for mohel records, as many mohels also traveled between congregations and may have maintained their own records. You can see here we have two different collections of marriages that were done by rabbis in our collection here at the Weiner. The next is naturalization. Why are naturalization papers rarely found for women? It's a great place to find information, and yet we're always at a loss. And I think it's important for us to remember that this is because naturalization records exist to record a bureaucratic process, the becoming of a citizen. And thus, who and what type of record exists is tied to the legislation and the understanding of that person's agency. So we have to look to the legislation to understand why we're not seeing these records. And you can see that in 1802, it was just free white persons, and that didn't address women. We couldn't vote. We weren't legally recognized as a person. And then, what do you know? In 1919, the Cable Act is in response to women's right to vote. We have the right to vote, and now we are suddenly being recognized in the Cable Act, and we can now become citizens on our own. It is not through marriage. It is not because we had children. It is only on our own accord. And so this is kind of a wonderful thing to remember, is that before 1919 and 1922, you might not be able to find a naturalization record, but that's okay. Because we can follow the men. While women may not have had paper records to prove that they were citizens, we can also often find them hiding in the records of their men. For instance, here you have the name, birth date, location, and current address of the wife, as well as a name, birth date, and location of a female child, Alice. Speaking of following the men, it's a good principle to apply all the time when we're looking for the women in these records. We can call it the fan club, friends and family, associates, and neighbors. And you can see this banquet honoring Elihu Stone here, that we have quite the fan club to follow. The archives exist so that we can do contextual research, going beyond the vital records, right? Archives hold a variety of published and unpublished materials that we organize into categories. And that's where you're going to be able to locate some of these ladies. These records usually hold information that goes beyond just the vital records and can help you build a contextual understanding of what the life was like for your female ancestors. Some examples that we're going to go over today are diaries, correspondence, photographs, recipes, and organizational records. We'll start with a diary. We have several collections of diaries and journals written by women in our collection that offer interesting perspectives of everyday life. Diaries written by an individual who lived in the same community as one of your ancestors can provide some insight into the events that affected that community. This is the diary of Vivian Robinson. You can see that she wrote, "Warm, Saturday, March 17th, 1945, went to show, worked in store, came home, listened to records. Mom and dad came home and we had a snack." This diary from her high school years gives brief but insightful descriptions of her daily life, school, work, dentist appointments, and hanging out with her parents. Benjamin and Gussie Robinson owned the new National 5 and 10 shop in Lowell, Massachusetts. Vivian went on to attend junior college at Westbrook Community College and later attended Boston University. She married Fred Garman from Dorchester, Massachusetts, and his family also happened to be in retail, running 2 food marts, Garman's and Morton's, in Dorchester. Fred and Vivian were among the first Jewish families to settle in the Wellesley area, where they raised their family and were active members of the community. Many early yearbooks often resembled the white pages. Additionally, the cost of producing or purchasing a yearbook may have been a hindrance, and so many students would keep autograph books to have their friends sign at the end of the year. This autograph book has a pretty interesting autograph from this young woman. "When I am dead and in my grave and all my bones are rotten, this little book will tell my name, though I will be forgotten." And that's from Constance Winchester. This autograph book belonged to Lillian Glickman, and Lillian was born on May 6, 1915, to Harry and Esther Glickman in Lynn, Massachusetts. Both Esther and Harry were Russian immigrants. She attended Cobbett School and Lynn English High, both in Lynn. She worked as a clerk for a number of years, including at Working Men's Co-op Bakery and the grocery store chain Stop and Shop, where she won the Checker of the Year award in 1965. She was active in many Jewish organizations, including the Jewish Welfare Board and Temple Beth Hillel Sisterhood, and was an avid traveler, particularly on cruise ships. Lillian died July 10th, 2003. Here's a picture of the lovely young Lillian, hopefully on one of her lovely trips. Next, we can look to correspondence. Letters can be details of ordinary life or contain genealogical events. Though undated correspondence can be frustrating, using clues in the letters can help us. For instance, in this letter, the writer references The Bad Seed, which was a play that was written in 1954 and was on Broadway for only 1 year. And it happened to be the year that this writer was living in New York City. From this, we can glean a general time frame, the nature of their role in the company that they worked at, and their social and religious activities that they took part in. We might even gain some insight into a relationship. This letter is from Genevieve Gloria Geller Weiner. She was born in New York to Max and Ida and graduated from New Rochelle High School in 1948. Then she attended Wellesley College. It was at Wellesley that she met her later husband, Justin Weiner. After graduating, she moved to New York to work for a newspaper and ended up working in public relations until she moved back to Boston in 1955 to marry Justin. They had 3 children and then were very active in their local community. Genevieve, after their sons were a bit older, started working for the family business, and she did so until she was a ripe old age. She died October 17th, 2019, at the age of 88. We can also look to photographs. Also, a photograph of Genevieve's is this image of the Nanette house. Now, what can we learn from a picture? It offers us a lot of contextual clues, right? There's a lot of women in this photo, so let's follow a breadcrumb trail. One thing we know, we're at Wellesley. It's 1952. and we're at Nonnet House. So we know we're at an on-campus residence. What can we learn from other resources about that residence hall that tell us what was life like? We can look to yearbooks, graduation programs, alumni newsletters and clubs. What did they do after they took this picture? We can look to the library and thesis projects to find out what it was that they were learning about, what it was that they were questioning, and where did these women go after. So think of a photograph as just a starting point. Another place to find these great photographs that might offer you gold mines is this page from a scrapbook is a good example. We have here the Helen Golden scrapbook, and this is a pretty much a gold mine for any of the family members of other girls in this here Willows Club photo. Helen included a roster for the photo, as well as several portraits with captions, dating and dates with names. So always be on the lookout for scrapbooks. The next is ephemera. These tefillin or ritual prayer boxes are unusual for many that we see in our collection because they've been decorated by hand and list information about the matriarch and patriarch of this family. It tells their names, lifespans, and their relations. The donor, Marjorie, recalls that these tefillin were actually kept in a kitchen drawer that was never to be opened in their family home, and they were only revealed to them when the home was going to be cleared out. So this is an amazing example of a very unusual place where you might find women in the archives. The next are recipes. Now here is a different take on women's voices, right? But we know we can learn a lot from a recipe. I was particularly tied to this one because I was unsure what junket was. So if you knew what junket was, you're ahead of me here. But this tells a lot about the time period. Not only do we learn what they ate, but we learn about what kind of cooking technology and food storage they were using. So you can learn quite a bit from looking at a recipe. The next are looking at women's organizational records. Finding out what it was that your female ancestor was doing with their time is extremely valuable. And you have several different places within these organizational records that you might be able to make these connections. The first are going to be in meeting minutes, of course, where you're going to find out exactly what it was and who was participating in these meetings and what they were deciding on. And I can tell you, they ate a lot of ice cream. That's what I've learned from Ladies Auxiliary meeting minutes. You can also look for membership cards. This will tell you usually the date that they joined, which address that location was at, and it could even give you a lot of information about where they were in life because it'll have their full name. The last are photographs, of course, of these organizations. They did a very good job usually of taking annual photos and often even notated who was in which positions, especially if you were on the board. The next thing you want to look at are community events. Similar to women's organizations, you also want to look at the community centers. What were they doing? Were they putting on plays? Because that is going to be a great place to see what was happening in the social world of your female ancestors and likely even locate them as fairy princesses in a recital. Next, we're going to look at philanthropic organizations. You can see here that this is a photograph from the highest Port of Boston Records collection at the Weiner JHC. And they started a school on Blossom Street for women to learn to Americanize. And you can see here, they've even notated who's in this photograph. So there's a bunch of women there. I'm going to quickly spotlight the highest collection, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was founded as a Jewish American nonprofit that provides humanitarian aid and assistance to refugees. It was established on November 27, 1881, originally to help with the large number of Russian Jewish immigrants to the United States who had left Europe to escape anti-Semitic persecution and violence. In 1975, the State Department asked Highest to aid in resettling 3,600 Vietnamese refugees. And since that time, the organization continues to provide support for refugees of all nationalities, religions, and ethnic origins. The organization works with people whose lives and freedom are believed to be at risk due to war, persecution, or violence, and has offices in the United States, across Latin America, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Since its inception, HIAS has helped to resettle more than 4.5 million people. The unsung hero of the HIAS collection is this woman here, Helen H Albert. She visibly ran HIAS for many decades and was seemingly never not in the office unless it was to visit someone in the East Boston Detention Center. She fought for, looked for as many avenues as she could to bypass strict immigration laws and quotas. The larger the case file, the more complex the case was, and the more invested Helen Albert was in that case. Unfortunately, we know very little about Helen herself. So naturally, I went to the presses. Searching newspaper collections, I found quite a bit of evidence of her work with HIAS and even her position at HIAS. And then, in all of my snooping, I found this, a marriage announcement for Helen Albert. She was going to be marrying Mr. Joseph Mickelson. It has the date, it has their address, as I confirmed with census records, and it even lists the rabbi who's going to be doing it. I then confirmed that the marriage did in fact take place, because later on, several years later, she's referenced in another HIAS article with her married name, Helen Albert Mickelson, as the hostess. So we know this happened, and this was a great breakthrough in finding out a bit more about Helen. And it's a reminder to never give up, because new records are being digitized all the time, and you're always going to be able to find something new. So every once in a while, try that place where you got stuck before, because you never know when you might get a break in the case. Another place to look is business records. Here you have pictured the Avenue Bazaar owned by the Millenteller family. The account books can place ancestors in a specific place in a specific time. Early account books that predate census records can also be used as substitutes. And if they cover a number of years, they can make it possible to track our ancestors' movements. The Millenteller family owned several businesses in the greater Boston area. On the left, you see a photo of their shop in the north end of Boston, and on the right is a cash book from their Roxbury Shade store. And the records, they tell a story. Here you can see that Mrs. Singer added items to her account. She bought 5 gallons of gas, 2 quarts of oil, and 2 sets of brass locks. Makes me a little afraid of what was going on in Mrs. Singer's house. Additionally, it reveals a lot about our social standings. Here you also have the salaries of 2 employees, Jose and Rose. And as you can see, Jose makes a significant amount more than Rose did. And that may be because the assumption at that point in time was that Jose was going to have a family to care for, and Rose was just adding a little bit to the book. I'd like to do some quick collection highlights. And I'd like to start off with the Evelyn Barovsky and Jano Roskin papers. Jano Roskin met Evelyn Barovsky when he became the director of music at Temple Israel, where she was the organist. In 1940, they were married, and the following year, Jano became a citizen of the United States. The couple then moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, where he was the director of music at Temple Beth El Zedek, and then unfortunately passed away in 1946. Now, that's enough about Jano. What I love about this collection is, 1, the look he's giving his wife in this photo, and 2, that it reveals parts of the lives of 3 women, actually. Ida, Evelyn, and Edith Barovsky. Evelyn was born in Boston in 1903 to Jacob and Ida Snyder Barovsky. She was a singer and a pianist who gained a following in Boston as a soloist and accompanist on the WNAC radio channel. She received her musical training from Boston University College of Music, and she studied under Felix Fox at his school in Boston. Evelyn was a lecturer at the Boston Center for Adult Education, and she conducted a choral group at the Jeremiah Burke Evening School Center in Roxbury. She played the organ at Temple Israel and was the assistant to Henry Gideon, Roskin's predecessor. After Jeannot's death, Evelyn returned to Boston to take up a position as music director and organist at Temple Sinai in Brookline, and she remained in this position until her death in 1967. Ida Snyder-Barovsky, Evelyn's mother, was born in Russia in 1883. She was known for her contributions to the Jewish community in East Boston, Chelsea, and Roxbury. She was a part of the women who pushed for the establishment of a Jewish hospital in Boston, which became the Beth Israel Hospital. She was an honorary director there, and when Beth Israel moved to Brookline, she was a member of the Roxbury Ladies Bikur Cholam Society that worked to found the Jewish Memorial Hospital on the same site. Ida worked as a vice president and a social worker at JMH for over 30 years, and she was named lifetime honorary director of the board for her service on behalf of the hospital. She died in Newton, Massachusetts in 1982, just shy of her 99th birthday. The collection includes many records from her professional and personal papers as well. On the right, you see Edith Barovsky Grosbane. She was born in Boston in 1905 and worked as the secretary to the vice president of Hovey's department store. Once the store was bought by Jordan Marsh, she became executive secretary to Rabbi Murray Rothman at Temple Shalom in Newton. She played piano and violin and often accompanied Evelyn. After Evelyn's death, Edith acted as the executor of her estate and managed the music publishing company that she had started with Jeannot. Edith married Mitchell Grosbane, a piano tuner who also played violin in the Wellesley Symphony Orchestra. Mitchell died in 1982 in Newton, and Edith died in 1993. Another wonderful woman in our collection is Jenny Loitman Barron, who was the first woman justice of the Massachusetts Superior Court. In college, she organized the Boston University Equal Suffrage League, and she later lobbied for the right of women to serve as jurors. She opened her own law practice in 1914, and in 1934, she was appointed Assistant Attorney General of Massachusetts, becoming the first woman to try a major criminal case in the state. Beyond her career in the criminal justice system, she worked as the first president of the Women's Division of American Jewish Congress and the national board member of Hadassah. Appointed as Superior Court Justice in 1957, she served on the bench until a week before her death at age 77. Now, how can you find relevant materials like this when you're on your search? One thing is understanding what different types of institutions offer you. Libraries versus archives, right? So libraries have published material, they have open browsable stacks, they often have multiple copies of materials that are organized by subject and genre, and they're fairly low security. Whereas an archive has unpublished manuscript materials with closed stacks, often things are kept offsite, and the staff must retrieve it for you. Everything is one of a kind or unique, and it's organized by a collection subject. Usually in our case, that's organizational or personal. And we have pretty high security. Everything is kept in a reading room. You can also look at cultural institutions to find archives. Sometimes we even live in libraries like we do at American Ancestors. Look to colleges, museums, cultural centers, historic houses, historical societies, and genealogical societies. Should also look towards government agencies, corporations, social clubs, religious institutions, and private or personal collections. Always begin your search in local repositories or where your ancestor lived. Look at historical societies, genealogical societies, and many of the other locations that we just looked at. To help you locate repositories, you can use a site called Archive Grid. It's a collection of over 7 million archival material descriptions and finding aids that have been harvested from repository websites. It provides access to detailed archival collection descriptions, such as documents, personal papers, and family histories, and other archival materials held by thousands of libraries, museums, historical societies, and archives. It also provides contact information for these institutions where the collections are kept. The majority of archival material descriptions in Archive Grid are from WorldCat, a library website, and primarily represent archival collections held by institutions here in the US. Some search tips. Use keywords. Anchor your search to a time period or a geographic location, and consider special characteristics of that person. So adding in information that makes them a little bit more notable than just a name. Many libraries that house archives are going to have an integrated central catalog where you can locate library and manuscript materials. Here's an example of our library catalog. A catalog record may bring you to a finding aid or a standalone archive where you can search directly in their finding aid repository. Finding aids are the maps to a collection. They tell you what the collection's about, what materials you can find there, the dates, and what subjects the collection spans. You can also look at our digital library, where we have many materials that have been digitized for you to view. You're going to want to search similarly. Here you can see I searched for the Louisa May Alcott Club records, and there you see they're popping up. And then here I'm able to see that record. And as you can see, there's multiple pages for me to read through. Unlike libraries, due to the nature of archival collections, archives may require an appointment for access. Check your repository's hours and reading room policies before arriving. When reaching out to an archive, let them know what materials you're looking for exactly. If you're unsure, ask for a reference consultation, and they can assist you in identifying materials that will be of use. Always include your name, relevant affiliations if required, when you're coming to visit, collection information such as the name, ID number, and if you've looked at the finding aid, what boxes you'd like for them to pull for you. In summary, today we've looked at the fact that archives include both published and unpublished materials. You can find genealogical events in Bible records, cemetery transcriptions, letters, and town records. Use manuscript collections to round out the details of your ancestor's life. Identify archives that may have records that could reveal more about your ancestor's life. Consider a variety of different types of material, such as letters, oral histories, photographs, material culture, etc., and how to utilize records of others whose lives may have been similar to learn more about the world of your ancestor. And now I'd like to hand it over to Rachel King.
Gabrielle, thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I learned so much about our collections and individuals in our collections that I didn't know. So we will shortly invite questions from the audience, and please, again, just an invitation to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But just before we get to questions, I wanted to let you all know about an exciting event that the Jewish Heritage Center has coming up on September 8th. If you are in the Boston area, we are hosting a free in-person program about the historical Jewish summer community on Nantasket Beach in Hull. Join us for stories and conversation about this really popular summer destination for Jewish families in the middle of the 20th century. We will have an ice cream social, and again, the event is free. It is Labor Day is really early this year, so this is an opportunity to extend your summer into September with this fun event by the beach. And you can learn more about that and other events with the Jewish Heritage Center at jewishheritagecenter.org/events. Okay, so let's turn to questions. We have a few questions submitted so far. Well, here's a good one. Catherine asks Gabrielle, how do I learn more about HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society? I can start by saying it's one of our biggest and most accessed collections, but Gabrielle, maybe you can tell the audience more about the HIAS as an organization and the records that are available.
Yes, absolutely. So we hold the records of the Boston port of HIAS, and what you can find in our collection is we have a wonderful finding aid that has every single case record listed out by name. So you can search those records to see if one of your ancestors may have used HIAS's services when they were coming over. Most of the records are going to be from that later period of the earlier period of the 20th century into the mid 20th century, a lot of records around the time of the Holocaust. And those records have a lot more information than some of the newer ones, where correspondence may make up a bulk of the file, just kind of with updates. However, we have been very lucky and we've been able to digitize quite a bit of the HIAS collection. And you can actually access records that are older than 72 years old on our digital library. So if you need any help with that, feel free to send us an email. We're happy to help folks access HIAS records that are available to the public. New York also has a HIAS records at the American Jewish Historical Society in New York. So you can also locate records for the New York port there at our sister archive.
Thank you. And speaking of the Boston port of HIAS, you mentioned how Helen Albert, who has long been one of our sheroes at the Jewish Heritage Center. She, as Gabrielle mentioned, we have so many case files of people seeking refuge in the United States, and there's a ton of paperwork and correspondence from local people who are trying to sponsor these immigrants, and people in Europe and so on. And Helen Alpert's name and sort of hand is all over these documents for decades. And she's really an unsung character in this really powerful story. And so Gabrielle, it was wonderful that you went looking for more information about who she was as a human being, and we hope to keep fleshing out her story because she was so committed and she helped so many people. Marcia mentions or says, you mentioned that Evelyn Barovsky sang on WNAC. My mother sang on WNAC in the 1930s. Do you know where the records from WNAC may be available?
I don't actually know where the WNAC records are, but I wouldn't be surprised if the company that ran the radio station still had records from the earlier days. That's definitely something to look into, and I would Google it for you right now, except my screen is the one sharing, so I can't, but you've definitely made me eager to find out, and if I do, I will find you, Marcia, and send you the answer.
Jane asks, I'm looking for a Polish immigrant who abandoned a great aunt, moved to Lowell, and supposedly became a priest. To whom should I talk about this type of Bobby Miza?
Well, Jane, I think that this is a pretty good place to start. I'd be happy to help you to see if we have any records about your great aunt, or the immigrant who abandoned your great aunt, I guess. But this is exactly how you have to start. First, you got to look for any records on your aunt, and then we have to find who this Polish immigrant is. So if you can find out a little bit more and send me an email, I'd be happy to help you hunt this down.
Cassie asks, and I'm guessing this may be a little far afield for us, but I'm going to pose it to you. Cassie asks, could you please ask Gabrielle if she's ever studied medieval Jewish women and what were her findings?
I unfortunately am not a scholar in medieval Jewish women, but I would love to know more. And unfortunately, our collection at the Weiner Jewish Heritage Center is geographically based. And so there's not going to be a ton of content that comes into our archive on medieval Jewish women. But I would love to know what one could find perhaps in some Eastern European institutions to see what survived about medieval Jewish women.
I had a question of my own. So you mentioned the naturalization records, and they just did not exist for women prior to the early 20th century. We know in so many other cases that you could find hints of women in records about the men in their lives, a father, a husband, a brother. Was there any mention of the women accompanying or, living with, or who were part of the men's lives who were being naturalized? Or is there anything in the male naturalization records that hints at the women?
Yep. So I did share a record, a naturalization record with you that did tell about the female family members. So it not only told you who the wife was and where they lived, how old they were, and where they were from, but they also listed anyone under 18 that was living with them. And not every naturalization application has this information, but at certain points in time, they did include more extensive questions like that. But there's also, I've seen ones from the same year from maybe a different office that just didn't have the same info, because it really depended on the jurisdiction that you were in when you were trying to naturalize.
Okay, so it's worth looking there for sure. Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely follow the fan club principle. Find the documents for the men, especially if you're looking for, ship crossings, things like that. I would look for the men's name, because they probably got the woman's name wrong, or her age, or they just assume something completely strange about her. But you might be able to locate your women if you look for the men first.
I also had a question about, you mentioned ketubot, the Jewish marriage contract, which would often include Hebrew names. So that's an interesting extra bit of information you can get from those records, is not just a woman's sort of anglicized name, but her Hebrew name as well. Do you have any tips for sort of moving back and forth from kind of civil marriage records and ketubot? Is there any kind of connection that one can find, or do you really have to look at those as two completely separate kinds of documents?
They are technically different types of documents. And for that reason, you're much more likely to find a clerical marriage license rather than your ketubah, because someone in your family would have had to donate the ketubah, which most people hold very dear. So it's only when families have shared them with us at the archive that we've been able to get some wonderful examples of them. But for the most part, people really do hold on to those, and you're not going to find as many of them in the archives, not from recent history, at least.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth asks, does the center have any Jewish records from Germany in the early 1800s? I could probably answer that, but I'll let you, the archivist.
So we don't have any records from Germany in the early 1800s, but we do have records of families that did come from that region during that time. And it's really going to be a situation where you're more looking at records from people who were like your ancestors more than records of Germany. The Jewish Genealogical Society of Greater Boston does have a really wonderful guide to researching records from Europe. And I really suggest generally to all of our patrons that that is their next stop, because they've really done a wonderful job of putting together those resources for records abroad.
I love it when audience members help each other. So Penny mentions medieval Jewish women. Off the top of my head, I suggest history professor Rami Targoff at Brandeis. She wrote a book, I think that's a she, if I remember. Professor Targoff wrote a book on a medieval Italian woman and Shakespeare's women. And David says, another source I've used for Jewish female parentage are gravestones. Many times they will list at least the father's Hebrew name. This can help confirm connections to others in a family. So thank you for helping to answer some of your fellow audience members' questions. Trisha asks, please explain how to correlate Excel spreadsheets of various family members. I don't know
Yes.
if that's an Excel question or if it's a reference to to the slide you showed.
So I'm just pulling up
Yeah.
the slide for you here so that you can see a little bit more clearly what it is that I meant by gathering information. So you can see here that I use an Excel spreadsheet, and I like them because they're really easy to locate things on if I end up getting a lot of information. But I'll say a location, the surname that they used, the religion, if noted, nationality, societies, businesses, and resources. And I'll usually link if it's an online resource so that I can go directly there. And what I'm doing is I'm just recording all the information and where I'm getting it. So similar to like writing a paper about your family, you're getting ready to write your bibliography. And so you can not only use it to structure your research and keep track of it, but it's also a good way to keep track of your resources. Because when you download these files from a lot of archives, you're going to get a file that's called some random ID number. And so you can also add that into your Excel spreadsheet. You can put in an image ID number there, and that can help you keep track of it when you've been downloading things too. So think of it like an index card that's really specific, a really, really specific index card.
Esther adds about medieval women. We have some very knowledgeable people about researching medieval women. A fascinating Jewish medieval woman in England was, I'm going to mispronounce this, Licoricia. Easy to Google. I do know that there are some scholars of medieval Jewish women in Europe. So I think you could certainly Google or look in library catalogs, starting with the search terms. Speaking of search terms, Gabrielle, I wanted to ask you one more question. You had talked about narrowing in search terms and using specific characteristics, which would help narrow the search. Can you give an example of what you mean by that?
Yeah, so anytime we're searching, especially a name where there's going to be a lot of returns, I always try and add some specific details in, like if I know they were a member of a specific synagogue, or I know that they were alive during a certain time, or they lived in a certain city, or they had, 3 sons, or if they were divorced, like things that I know about them that might help to identify the correct records. And even if it's just a keyword, if I put in a bunch of keywords about what they did with their life, where they went to shul, if they were, went to this Hebrew school, because if I can find one record of them that I can identify, I know that it's just the beginning of everything else, right? Because it's just one breadcrumb.
Okay. I think that's all our questions for now. A number of you have asked how to get in touch with Gabrielle to follow up with some questions or help with your own searches. So we can give you Gabrielle's email, which is gabrielle.roth@nehgs.org. We can drop that into the chat as well. Thank you, Kelly, our tech producer. And we want to thank you so much for joining us today. There's always more to learn. This has been fascinating. It's a wonderful combination of how-to and also sharing some of the stories in our particular collections. We are always, as Gabrielle pointed out so well, there's so much information, historical information about men, not as much recorded about women. You do have to do some sleuthing, and we as an archive are always interested in collecting papers and records that do reveal the lives of Jewish women. So if you would like to talk, if you have family papers of Jewish women who settled in or came through New England, we would love to hear from you. And you can also reach out to gabrielle.roth@nehgs.org. Since we're almost at the hour, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank Gabrielle so much for that really interesting and lively presentation. As you leave the program today, you will be asked to take a very brief survey, and we hope that you'll take just a minute to fill it out. Your feedback is incredibly helpful to us to develop further programming. And I invite you to learn more about the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center on our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. And I would like to mention that this free program was made possible by contributions from to the Jewish Heritage Center and American ancestors from people all over the world. We'd be so grateful if you would consider making a donation of your own to support our educational and preservation work. Thank you so much. I wish you a happy remainder of the day. And again, if you're in the area, in the greater Boston area, and want to join us for a free program with ice cream on September 8th, please do. And again, you can find that on our website as well. Until then, and until the next program, be well, and we will see you soon.